They called me into the glass conference room at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. No explanation, just my supervisor's voice crackling through the desk phone saying, "Mitchell, need you in conference room C, now." I thought it was about the quarterly compliance review, maybe a question about the discrepancies I'd flagged in the Southeast region accounts. But when I walked in and saw three people I'd never met before sitting across from HR Director Sarah Kelman, their folders already open, their expressions already decided, I knew this wasn't about compliance. This was about me. My name is David Mitchell, and for 18 months I was a Senior Financial Analyst at Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions, a medical supply distribution company that claimed to serve rural hospitals across 7 states. Before that, I spent 12 years in the Army, most of it in military intelligence, learning how to spot patterns others missed, how to follow paper trails that people thought they'd buried, and how to stay calm when everything around you is falling apart. Those skills served me well in Afghanistan and Iraq. I never thought I'd need them in a corporate office in Charlotte, North Carolina. Pinnacle wasn't my dream job, but it was steady work with good benefits, and after transitioning out of the military, steady felt like a luxury. The company had been around for 15 years, built by CEO Marcus Whitfield, a former hospital administrator who understood the challenges rural healthcare facilities faced when trying to source medical equipment. At least, that's what the company brochure said. That's what Marcus said during my interview, leaning back in his leather chair, speaking passionately about serving America's forgotten hospitals, the ones barely keeping their doors open, the ones that couldn't afford to negotiate with the big suppliers. "We're not just moving inventory, David," he'd told me that day, his voice carrying the kind of conviction that made you want to believe. "We're keeping these places alive. When a hospital in rural Mississippi needs ventilators and can't afford the markup from the major distributors, we step in. When a clinic in eastern Kentucky is about to close because they can't source basic surgical supplies at reasonable prices, we find a way." It's not just business, it's mission work. I believed him. Hell, I wanted to believe him. After spending years seeing what happened to communities when their infrastructure collapsed, the idea of helping hospitals stay operational felt like continuing the service I'd started in uniform. Marcus seemed to understand that. During the interview, he'd asked about my deployment experience, nodded thoughtfully when I mentioned working with Medical Corps units, talked about how military precision and attention to detail were exactly what Pinnacle needed as they expanded their operations. The office itself felt legitimate, professional but not flashy, open floor plan with clean lines, motivational posters about teamwork and integrity, a break room that always had decent coffee. My desk was in the financial analysis department, a cluster of 8 workstations where we tracked inventory costs, supplier relationships, and regional profit margins. The work was straightforward: analyze purchase orders, verify supplier invoices, track delivery schedules, and flag any irregularities for management review. My colleagues were good people. Janet Torres, a CPA who'd been with the company for 6 years, patient enough to walk me through Pinnacle's accounting software, and quirky enough to keep a collection of rubber ducks on her monitor. Robert Chen, fresh out of business school, eager to prove himself and always ready to grab lunch and talk about process improvements. Lisa Hartwell, the department supervisor, former military herself, Navy logistics, who understood the adjustment period and gave me space to find my rhythm. For the first 8 months, everything felt normal. I learned the systems, built relationships with suppliers, got comfortable with the workflow. The numbers made sense, purchase orders aligned with invoices, delivery schedules matched hospital requests, profit margins were healthy but not excessive. Pinnacle was doing exactly what Marcus claimed, helping rural hospitals access medical supplies at fair prices while maintaining sustainable business operations. But around month 9, I started noticing small inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic, just tiny discrepancies that caught my attention, because military intelligence had trained me to spot patterns that didn't fit. A purchase order for surgical masks listed one price, but the corresponding invoice from the supplier showed a different amount, always lower. Hospital billing records showed Pinnacle charging standard rates, but the internal cost calculations seemed off by small percentages. Individual transactions meant nothing, but when I started tracking them over time, a pattern emerged. At first I assumed it was a software glitch or a training issue I'd missed. I mentioned it to Lisa during our weekly one-on-one, expecting her to point out some aspect of the billing system I didn't understand. Instead, she got quiet, asked me to send her the specific examples I'd found, and said she'd look into it. A week later, she told me the discrepancies had been resolved, that it was indeed a software issue that IT had fixed, but the inconsistencies didn't stop. They got more frequent, and they started following a pattern I recognized from my intelligence training. Deliberate obfuscation designed to look like random errors. Someone was manipulating the numbers, but doing it carefully, systematically, in a way that would be nearly impossible to detect unless you were specifically looking for it. That's when I started keeping my own records. Nothing official, just a small notebook where I tracked the discrepancies I noticed. Dates, amounts, suppliers, hospitals. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my military training was making me see threats where none existed. But the pattern kept growing, and the amounts kept adding up. The breakthrough came during my 15th month, when I was assigned to audit the Southeast region's quarterly numbers. Robert was on vacation, so I was covering his accounts, including several hospitals in rural Georgia and Alabama. As I dug into the purchase orders and supplier relationships, I found something that made my blood run cold. Pinnacle was billing a small hospital in rural Alabama $12,000 for a shipment of ventilator supplies. The hospital's payment records showed they'd paid in full, but when I cross-referenced the supplier invoices, I discovered that Pinnacle had only paid the supplier $3,200 for those same supplies. The markup wasn't just excessive, it was criminal. This wasn't a company helping struggling hospitals, it was a company exploiting their desperation. I spent the next 3 weeks carefully documenting similar transactions across the Southeast region. The pattern was consistent and devastating. Pinnacle was systematically overcharging rural hospitals by margins that ranged from 200% to 400%. They weren't serving America's forgotten hospitals. They were bleeding them dry. But the worst part wasn't the fraud itself. The worst part was how perfectly it was hidden within legitimate operations. The majority of Pinnacle's business was clean, fair, exactly what Marcus claimed it was, but buried within that legitimate business was a parallel operation targeting the most vulnerable hospitals, the ones too desperate to question prices, too isolated to have alternatives, too financially strained to audit every invoice. It was elegant, systematic, and absolutely devastating to the hospitals being targeted. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were real institutions, serving real communities, being pushed closer to closure by the very company that claimed to be helping them survive. I knew I had to report it, but I also knew that my military background had taught me to be thorough, to build an airtight case before making accusations. So I kept documenting, kept gathering evidence, kept building the kind of comprehensive file that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. What I didn't know was that someone had noticed my pattern of database queries, my unusual interest in cross-referencing supplier invoices with hospital billing records. Someone was watching me build the case that would destroy them, and they were preparing their own countermove. The first sign something had shifted came during the monthly all-hands meeting in early October. Marcus stood at the front of the conference room, his usual confident demeanor intact, but his words carried a different edge. He was talking about company culture, about the importance of team alignment, about how Pinnacle's success depended on everyone being fully committed to our mission and values. "We're not just colleagues here," he said, scanning the room with those penetrating eyes that had once made me feel included. "We're a family, and like any family, we need to make sure everyone is rowing in the same direction. There's no room for doubt, no space for questioning our core principles, no tolerance for divided loyalties." The phrase divided loyalties hit me like a physical blow. I kept my expression neutral, the way I'd learned during intelligence briefings, where showing any reaction could compromise an operation. But inside, alarm bells were ringing. This wasn't the passionate hospital advocate I'd interviewed with 18 months ago. This was someone sending a message. After the meeting, I found myself replaying every interaction I'd had with Marcus over the past few weeks. The way he'd nodded curtly when we passed in the hallway instead of his usual warm greeting. The fact that I hadn't been invited to the quarterly strategy session, despite financial analysis being directly relevant to strategic planning. The way conversations seemed to pause when I entered rooms, resuming only after I'd settled into my seat. I started paying closer attention to the social dynamics around the office. using the observational skills that had kept me alive in hostile territory. Jeanette was still friendly, but her usual chatty updates about weekend plans had become more reserved. Robert seemed nervous whenever we discussed work, cutting conversations short and avoiding eye contact. Even Lisa, my former Navy supervisor, who understood military transitions, had become formal and distant during our weekly check-ins. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. I was being isolated, slowly but systematically, separated from the informal networks that made office life tolerable. Coffee invitations stopped coming. Lunch groups formed without including me. Project collaboration became purely transactional, lacking the easy camaraderie that had made the first year at Pinnacle genuinely enjoyable. At first, I wondered if I was being paranoid, if my military background was making me interpret normal workplace dynamics as something more sinister, but the timing was too coincidental. The isolation had begun shortly after I'd started my deep dive into the Southeast region accounts. Right around the time I'd uncovered the systematic overcharging that was bleeding rural hospitals dry. The turning point came during a seemingly routine IT security training session. The entire company was required to attend a standard quarterly update about password protocols and data protection policies. But buried within the standard presentation was a new section about insider threats and the importance of monitoring unusual database access patterns. Loyalty isn't just about following company policies, the IT director explained, clicking through slides that felt increasingly targeted. It's about understanding that unauthorized investigation into company operations, even with good intentions, can expose sensitive business information to competitors and regulatory agencies. We trust our employees to focus on their assigned responsibilities and report concerns through proper channels. I sat in the back row, maintaining the same neutral expression I'd perfected during intelligence briefings, but my mind was racing. They knew someone had flagged my database queries, noticed my pattern of cross-referencing supplier invoices with hospital billing records. The evidence I'd been carefully gathering to build an airtight case had also built a digital trail that led directly back to me. After the training session, I made a decision that would have seemed paranoid to my civilian colleagues, but felt like basic operational security to someone with my background. I stopped using company systems for my investigation. Instead, I began photographing documents with my personal phone during late evening hours when the office was empty. I started printing hard copies of key invoices and financial reports, taking them home one or two at a time to avoid detection. I created a secure backup of my evidence on a personal encrypted drive, stored separately from anything connected to Pinnacle's network. The isolation campaign intensified over the following weeks. Marcus began scheduling department meetings during times when I was at client sites, then following up with summary emails that somehow never quite captured the full scope of what had been discussed. I was excluded from the annual planning retreat, told that budget constraints meant they could only send core team members. My project assignments became more routine, less strategic, clearly designed to limit my access to the financial data I'd been analyzing. But the most unsettling change was in how people talked about company culture. Suddenly, every meeting included references to team players and cultural fit. Marcus began holding informal culture talks with small groups of employees, emphasizing the importance of trust, loyalty, and supporting the mission without second-guessing leadership decisions. "We've built something special here," he told a group of newer employees during one of these sessions, which I overheard while working late. "But maintaining that culture requires constant vigilance. We need people who believe in what we're doing, not people who are looking for problems that don't exist." The message was clear, and it was spreading throughout the organization. Questioning company practices, even legitimate financial analysis, was being reframed as cultural disloyalty. The same critical thinking skills that made me effective in my role were being redefined as threats to team cohesion. I started documenting these cultural shifts alongside my financial evidence. The systematic isolation, the redefinition of analytical thinking as disloyalty, the creation of an us-system mentality that positioned any internal criticism as betrayal. It was a textbook case of organizational manipulation, designed to silence dissent by making dissent itself seem like a character flaw. The irony wasn't lost on me. In the military, questioning orders required careful consideration of timing and context, but intellectual integrity was ultimately valued. Critical analysis was seen as essential to mission success. Here, in a civilian corporate environment that claimed to value transparency and ethical business practices, the same intellectual rigor was being treated as a threat. I began to understand that the fraud I'd uncovered wasn't just a financial crime, it was enabled by a deliberately constructed culture that discouraged scrutiny. The family atmosphere Marcus promoted wasn't about genuine care for employees, it was about creating emotional bonds that made people reluctant to report wrongdoing. The emphasis on mission work and serving rural hospitals wasn't just marketing copy, it was a moral shield that made questioning company practices feel like betraying a noble cause. During my final weeks of normal employment, I watched younger employees absorb these cultural messages with growing concern. Robert, who had started the job with genuine enthusiasm for process improvement, began avoiding analytical questions that might seem critical. Janet, despite her CPA training that should have made her naturally suspicious of financial irregularities, stopped asking probing questions during department meetings. The culture wasn't just protecting the fraud, it was actively creating the conditions that allowed it to flourish. By defining loyalty as unquestioning acceptance and framing critical thinking as cultural toxicity, Marcus had built an organization where the very skills needed to detect wrongdoing were systematically discouraged. I realized that my military background hadn't just made me better at spotting the financial irregularities, it had made me immune to the cultural manipulation that kept other employees from looking too closely. The same training that taught me to maintain operational security in hostile environments had prepared me to recognize when I was being targeted by my own organization. But recognition and protection were two different things. I could see the trap being built around me, could understand the psychological techniques being used to isolate and discredit me, but I couldn't prevent them from working. The evidence I was gathering would be worthless if my credibility was destroyed before I could present it. The question wasn't whether they would move against MIT, was when, and whether I'd be prepared for what came next. The moment I realized I needed protection came during a seemingly innocent conversation with Lisa Hartwell 3 weeks before they fired me. She had asked me to stay after our weekly one-on-one meeting, closing the door to her office and settling back into her chair with the kind of deliberate calm I recognized from military briefings that were about to take an uncomfortable turn. "David, I need to ask you something directly," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "Are you happy here at Pinnacle?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how carefully she'd framed it. Not whether I was performing well, not whether I had concerns about my work, but whether I was happy. It was the kind of question designed to elicit an emotional response, to get me to voice dissatisfaction that could later be used to justify my removal. "I'm committed to doing good work," I replied, falling back on the non-committal responses that had served me well during intelligence operations. "Why do you ask?" Lisa leaned forward slightly, adopting what she probably thought was a concerned, maternal expression. "Some people have mentioned that you seemed disconnected lately, not quite fitting in with the team dynamics. I wanted to make sure you felt supported." There it was, the setup. They were building a narrative around my attitude and cultural fit, creating a paper trail of concerns that would justify whatever action they were planning. I realized that this conversation was being documented, probably recorded, certainly reported back to Marcus and HR. That night, I sat in my apartment and made a decision that would have seemed paranoid to most civilians, but felt like basic survival to someone with my background. I needed to create my own insurance policy, something that would protect both the evidence I'd gathered and my ability to present it if everything went sideways. I started with the digital trail. Over the next 2 weeks, working late in the empty office, and during weekend hours, when security was minimal, I methodically copied every document related to the Southeast region fraud onto encrypted drives. But I didn't just copy the evidence, copied everything. Email threads between Marcus and the regional managers, internal memos about pricing strategies, board meeting minutes that referenced market optimization in rural territories, supplier contracts that showed the real cost of medical supplies versus what hospitals were being charged. The key was making it look routine. I used my legitimate access to financial databases to run reports that seemed related to my assigned projects, but actually captured the broader pattern of systematic overcharging. When I needed documents outside my normal purview, I waited for opportunities when colleagues left their workstations unlocked, quickly photographing relevant files before anyone noticed. but digital evidence was only part of the protection I needed. I also began documenting the cultural campaign being waged against me. Every conversation like the one with Lisa got summarized in a secure journal. Every meeting I was excluded from, every project I was removed from, every subtle indication that I was being isolated, all of it went into a detailed timeline that showed the systematic nature of my marginalization. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Pinnacle's employee handbook included a whistleblower protection policy that most employees probably never read. Buried in Section 12 of the HR manual was a detailed procedure for reporting suspected financial irregularities, complete with protections against retaliation and requirements for internal investigation before any disciplinary action could be taken. More importantly, the policy required that any employee raising concerns about financial practices be given written notice of any performance or cultural issues at least 30 days before termination, with specific documentation of improvement attempts. It was boilerplate, legal language designed to protect the company from wrongful termination lawsuits, but it also created a procedural shield I could use. On a Tuesday evening in late November, I drafted a formal whistleblower complaint using the exact language and procedures outlined in the employee handbook. I documented the systematic overcharging of rural hospitals, provided specific examples with dates and amounts, and requested a formal investigation. But I didn't submit it immediately. Instead, I prepared multiple copies, one for internal filing, one for my attorney, one for my secure records, and one that would be automatically sent to state and federal regulatory agencies if I was terminated, without following proper procedures. The timing was critical. By filing the complaint internally first, I established legal whistleblower protections that would make it significantly more difficult for Pinnacle to retaliate without exposing themselves to federal prosecution. But I also knew that filing the complaint would accelerate whatever timeline they had for removing me. I spent my final week of normal employment preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I created detailed instructions for my attorney about how to handle the evidence if something happened to me. I established secure communication channels with contacts at the Department of Health and Human Services who specialized in healthcare fraud cases. I even drafted resignation letters with different effective dates, giving me options depending on how aggressively they moved against me. The most important preparation, though, was psychological. I knew from military experience that successful operations required mental discipline under pressure. When they came for me and I was certain they would die, needed to remain calm, professional, and strategic. No emotional reactions that could be used to justify their narrative about cultural fit. No defensive responses that would make me seem unstable or unreliable. I also prepared for the practical realities of sudden termination. I gradually moved personal items out of my office, taking 1 or 2 items home each day until my desk looked normal but contained nothing I couldn't afford to lose. I backed up my contacts and transferred any legitimate work files to formats I could access from home. I even started parking in a different section of the garage, closer to the exit, in case they tried to escort me out quickly. During my final days, I watched the office dynamics with the detached observation of someone conducting surveillance. Marcus had stopped acknowledging me entirely, his usual friendly greetings replaced by studied indifference. Lisa's weekly check-ins became increasingly formal and documented. Janet and Robert began actively avoiding casual conversation. Their discomfort obvious whenever we were in the same room, but the most telling sign was the increase in culture. Conversations around the office. Marcus held 3 separate all-hands meetings during my final week, each one emphasizing the importance of team loyalty and the dangers of toxic employees who didn't embrace company values. He spoke about trust, about the family atmosphere at Pinnacle, about how some people were simply not the right fit for their mission-driven culture. Sometimes, he said during the last meeting I would attend, looking directly at me across the conference room, protecting our culture means making difficult decisions about people who can't align with our values, regardless of their technical skills. I sat perfectly still, my expression neutral, my hands folded calmly in my lap, but inside I was counting down. They had made their decision. They had built their narrative. They had prepared their justification. What they didn't know was that I had prepared too, and unlike their narrative about cultural fit and team dynamics, my preparation was backed by federal law, documented evidence, and the kind of systematic thinking that had kept me alive in hostile territory. The trap they thought they were building around me was about to become a cage they had built around themselves. The termination meeting lasted exactly 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when Sarah Kellman from HR started reading from her prepared script and checked it again when she slid the separation agreement across the table. 11 minutes to end 18 months of employment and attempt to bury evidence of systematic fraud that was bleeding rural hospitals across 7 states. David, we've decided to part ways with you, effective immediately, Sarah said, her voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone who had delivered this speech before. This decision is based on cultural fit concerns and your inability to align with Pinnacle's collaborative work environment. I sat perfectly still, maintaining the neutral expression I'd perfected during hostile interrogations, while she continued reading from what was obviously a carefully crafted legal document. No mention of performance issues, no reference to missed deadlines or failed projects, just vague language about team dynamics and cultural alignment, the kind of subjective criteria that would be nearly impossible to challenge in court. The 3 strangers introduced themselves as Marcus's external consultants, brought in to facilitate organizational transitions, translation, corporate specialists hired to handle terminations that might involve legal complications. Their presence confirmed what I already suspected: this wasn't a routine firing. This was a calculated operation, designed to neutralize a specific threat. We understand this may come as a surprise, one of the consultants said, his expensive suit and practiced sympathy indicating he'd done this many times before. But sometimes these situations develop gradually, and it becomes clear that despite everyone's best efforts, the fit just isn't right. They had thought this through carefully. No witnesses who might later testify about my actual work performance. No documentation of specific incidents that could be disputed. Just a clean narrative about cultural incompatibility, delivered by people who had no personal history with me, and therefore couldn't be accused of bias or retaliation. Sarah pushed a tablet across the table displaying my final paycheck calculation: 2 weeks severance plus accrued vacation time, contingent on signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and non-compete clause. The NDA was particularly extensive, prohibiting me from discussing not just proprietary business information, but also internal company practices, operational procedures, and cultural observations. The separation agreement includes standard confidentiality provisions, Sarah explained, as if reading my mind. Nothing unusual, just protection for both parties as we move forward. But I had read enough legal documents during my military service to recognize when standard wasn't actually standard. The non-compete clause was unusually broad, preventing me from working for any healthcare-related organization for 18 months. The non-disclosure terms were so comprehensive they would effectively prevent me from cooperating with any investigation into Pinnacle's business practices. Even the timeline was aggressivized: had 48 hours to sign or forfeit the severance entirely. I'll need some time to review this, I said calmly, my first words since entering the conference room. Of course, Sarah replied, though her tone suggested this was an unwelcome complication. You have until close of business Thursday. We'll need your company devices, access cards, and any materials in your possession before you leave today. One of the consultants leaned forward slightly. We hope you'll understand that this transition serves everyone's best interests. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what both parties need. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sign the agreement, accept the narrative, disappear quietly. In return, they'd provide a neutral reference and enough severance to cushion the transition. Refuse, and they were prepared to make my job search significantly more difficult through industry connections and carefully worded references about cultural fit issues. They escorted me back to my desk under the pretense of helping me gather personal items, but really, to ensure I didn't access any company systems or take any unauthorized materials. My colleagues tried to look busy, avoiding eye contact as I packed the few remaining personal items into a small cardboard box. The entire department had gone unnaturally quiet, everyone pretending to focus intently on their work while watching peripherally as their former teammate was processed out. Janet Torres finally broke the silence as I was unplugging my phone charger. This is really sudden, she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine confusion and concern. Sometimes these things happen quickly, I replied, keeping my tone neutral and professional. No point in making her uncomfortable or putting her in an awkward position with management. But as I said it, I noticed Robert Chen watching the interaction from across the room, his expression unreadable. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something that looked like recognition. Not surprise at my termination, but acknowledgement of something he'd been expecting. The realization hit me like cold water. Robert knew this was coming. Possibly, others did too. The security escort to the parking garage was conducted with professional courtesy, but unmistakable finality. Badge deactivated, building access revoked, email account suspended. Within 20 minutes of entering that conference room, I had been completely severed from Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions, transformed from trusted employee to potential security threat. As I drove home through Charlotte's afternoon traffic, I replayed every detail of the termination meeting, analyzing it with the same methodical approach I'd used for intelligence debriefs. The timing was significant. Tuesday afternoon, after most employees had left for the day, minimizing witnesses and disruption. The presence of external consultants suggested they'd been planning this for weeks, possibly months. The aggressive NDA and non-compete terms indicated they were specifically worried about what I might do with information I'd gathered. But the most telling detail was what they hadn't said. No mention of the financial analysis work that had consumed my last few months. No reference to the Southeast region accounts I'd been auditing. No discussion of the database queries that had presumably triggered their surveillance. They had fired me for cultural fit issues while carefully avoiding any mention of the work that had actually prompted my termination. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the separation agreement spread across my kitchen table, reading every clause with the attention to detail that had kept me alive in hostile territory. The document was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, designed to make signing seem like the only rational choice for someone who just wanted to move on with their life. But I wasn't someone who just wanted to move on. I was someone who had uncovered systematic fraud targeting vulnerable hospitals, someone who had documented evidence of criminal activity, someone who had a responsibility that transcended personal convenience or financial security. The separation agreement sat unsigned on my kitchen table, while I opened my laptop and began composing a different kind of document. Not a resignation letter or a response to their termination. Instead, I drafted a formal whistleblower complaint to the Department of Health and Human Services, complete with detailed documentation of Pinnacle's systematic overcharging of rural hospitals. They had given me 48 hours to sign their agreement and disappear quietly. Instead, I was going to give them something they hadn't expected, a federal investigation that would make their cultural fit narrative irrelevant and their NDA worthless. The war they thought they'd won with an 11-minute termination meeting was just beginning. The first piece of the deeper puzzle emerged 3 days after my termination, buried in an email thread I'd printed weeks earlier but hadn't fully understood at the time. I was sitting in my apartment, methodically organizing the evidence I'd gathered, when I found a forwarded message from Marcus to someone identified only as RC, with the subject line, "Mitchell, situation requires careful handling." The email was dated 2 weeks before my firing, which meant they'd been planning my removal while I was still conducting what I thought was legitimate financial analysis. But it was the content that made my hands shake as I read it. Our friend in the Army has been asking too many questions about rural pricing models. Need to accelerate timeline for cultural transition. Can't afford another Melissa situation. Another Melissa situation. I stared at that phrase for 10 minutes. My military-trained mind immediately recognizing the significance of referencing a previous incident. This wasn't the first time Pinnacle had dealt with an employee who'd gotten too close to discovering their fraud. There had been others. I spent the next 2 days conducting the kind of digital archaeology that my intelligence background had prepared me for, using publicly available information to piece together Pinnacle's employment history. What I found was a pattern that should have been obvious if anyone had been looking for it. Melissa Rodriguez had been Pinnacle's previous Senior Financial Analyst, working in the same role I'd held, terminated 14 months before my hire date for performance issues and cultural misalignment. According to her LinkedIn profile, she'd been a CPA with 8 years of healthcare finance experience, exactly the kind of qualified professional who would have been capable of spotting financial irregularities. But the timeline didn't make sense. According to Pinnacle's public filings, they'd experienced their most profitable quarter ever during Melissa's final months of employment. Why would they fire a financial analyst during their best financial performance period unless she'd discovered something they needed to hide? I found Melissa's contact information through professional networks and reached out carefully, using my personal email and explaining only that I was a former Pinnacle employee interested in discussing our shared experience. Her response came within hours, and the urgency in her message told me everything I needed to know. "We need to talk in person," she wrote. "Not over email or phone. If you're who I think you are, you've probably found what I found. And if you have, you're in more danger than you realize." We met at a small coffee shop in downtown Asheville, 2 hours from Charlotte, neutral territory where neither of us was likely to encounter current Pinnacle employees. Melissa was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made her termination for performance issues obviously fraudulent. "They didn't just fire me," she said quietly. "After we'd ordered coffee and found a corner table away from other customers, they destroyed me professionally. Made sure I couldn't get another job in healthcare finance for almost a year. When potential employers called Pinnacle for references, they got carefully worded responses about my difficulty working collaboratively and concerns about attention to detail." The story she told was eerily familiar. Melissa had discovered the same systematic overcharging I'd found, the same pattern of exploiting rural hospitals, desperation for medical supplies. But she'd made the mistake of bringing her concerns directly to Marcus, believing he would want to address what she assumed were unauthorized activities by regional managers. "He thanked me for bringing it to his attention," she said, her voice carrying the bitter edge of someone who'd learned too late about the nature of trust. "Said he'd investigate immediately and get back to me within a week. Instead, within 3 days, I started getting written warnings about minor administrative issues. Suddenly, every report I submitted had problems. Every deadline I met was somehow late. Every interaction with colleagues was documented as evidence of poor team dynamics. The systematic destruction of her credibility had taken 2 months. False documentation of performance issues, manufactured complaints from colleagues who'd been pressured to sign statements about her difficult personality, gradual removal from important projects and exclusion from team meetings. All building toward a termination that appeared justified on paper but was actually retaliation for discovering the fraud. "The worst part," Melissa continued, "was that they made me doubt myself, the way they documented everything, the way colleagues started avoiding me, the constant messaging about cultural fit. By the time they fired me, I almost believed I really was the problem." But Melissa had been more thorough in her documentation than they'd realized. She'd kept copies of her original fraud analysis, along with detailed records of the retaliation campaign. After her termination, she'd spent months building a case, consulting with employment attorneys and preparing to file complaints with multiple regulatory agencies. "Then my apartment was broken into," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "Nothing valuable was taken, no electronics, no jewelry, no cash. But my home office was searched thoroughly. The files I'd kept about Pinnacle were gone. So was my backup drive." The message was clear. They knew what evidence she'd gathered, and they had the resources to make it disappear. Her attorney had advised her that without the documentation, any complaint would be difficult to prove, especially against a company with Pinnacle's resources and reputation. "That's when I understood this wasn't just corporate fraud," Melissa said. "This was organized criminal activity with the kind of sophistication that suggested connections beyond what a regional medical supply company should have." She pulled out her phone and showed me a news article from 6 months after her termination. Pinnacle had been awarded a major contract with the Department of Veterans Affairs to supply medical equipment to rural VA facilities. The contract was worth $47 million over 3 years. And it had been personally announced by Marcus at a press conference emphasizing Pinnacle's commitment to serving underserved healthcare facilities. "They're not just stealing from desperate hospitals," Melissa explained. "They're using that stolen money to fund expansion into government contracts. The overcharging isn't just criminal, it's systematic. They're building an empire on the backs of rural communities that can't afford to fight back." The scope of what we'd uncovered was staggering. This wasn't a case of a few bad actors skimming profits. This was a deliberately constructed business model that used legitimate operations to camouflage systematic exploitation of vulnerable healthcare facilities. The cultural manipulation, the retaliation against whistleblowers, the sophisticated cover-up operations, all of it was designed to protect a criminal enterprise that was potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Melissa handed me a small flash drive. This is everything I managed to recreate after the break-in. It's not as complete as my original files, but it might help you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. She paused at the door, looking back at me with the kind of expression I'd seen on soldiers' faces after particularly brutal operations. David, these people aren't just corporate criminals. They have resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who threatens their operation. If you're planning to fight them, you better be prepared for a war. Driving back to Charlotte, I realized that everything I thought I understood about my situation had been naive. I hadn't just discovered fraud, I'd stumbled into a criminal conspiracy with tentacles reaching into government contracts and regulatory agencies. The termination meeting, the cultural fit narrative, the aggressive NDA, all of it was just the opening move in what was clearly a much larger and more dangerous game. The decision to activate my safeguards wasn't made in anger or desperation. It was made at 2:47 a.m. on a Friday morning, sitting at my kitchen table with 3 empty coffee cups, Melissa's flash drive, and a clarity that came from finally understanding the true scope of what I was fighting. The evidence spread across my table wasn't just documentation of corporate fraud. It was proof of a criminal enterprise that had been systematically bleeding rural hospitals while positioning itself for massive government contracts. I had spent the previous week methodically cross-referencing Melissa's reconstructed files with my own evidence, and the picture that emerged was far worse than either of us had individually discovered. Pinnacle wasn't just overcharging hospitals in the Southeast region. They were running similar operations in rural areas across 7 states, carefully targeting facilities that were geographically isolated, financially desperate, and administratively overwhelmed. The pattern was diabolically sophisticated. They would identify hospitals that were struggling financially, often those serving communities with declining populations and limited economic resources. Then they would approach these facilities with seemingly generous offers to streamline their medical supply procurement, presenting themselves as a solution to the complex logistics of sourcing everything from basic surgical supplies to specialized equipment. Once they had established relationships with these hospitals, Pinnacle would gradually increase their dependency by offering extended payment terms, bulk purchasing agreements, and exclusive supplier relationships that seemed financially advantageous. But buried within the complex contracts were clauses that allowed for market-based pricing adjustments and emergency supply surcharges that could be applied almost arbitrarily. The genius of the scheme was in how it exploited the operational realities of rural healthcare. These hospitals didn't have large procurement departments or sophisticated financial analysis capabilities. They were often run by small administrative staffs who were focused on patient care, not complex vendor relationship management. When Pinnacle's invoices arrived with prices that seemed high, the hospitals often assumed it reflected normal market fluctuations or emergency supply shortages, but the financial impact was devastating. According to the documentation Melissa and I had compiled, Pinnacle was systematically overcharging these facilities by amounts that represented significant percentages of their total operating budgets. For a small rural hospital operating on razor-thin margins, the difference between Pinnacle's actual costs and their charges could mean the difference between keeping services open and cutting critical programs. The most damning evidence was what we found when we traced the money. The excess profits from rural hospital overcharging weren't being distributed to shareholders or used for normal business expansion. Instead, they were being funneled into a subsidiary company that specialized in government contract consulting and regulatory compliance services. This subsidiary, called Strategic Healthcare Solutions, had been systematically using the stolen rural hospital money to fund lobbying efforts, political donations, and the kind of regulatory relationship building that had helped Pinnacle secure their massive Veterans Affairs contract. They weren't just stealing from desperate hospitals, they were using that stolen money to position themselves as trusted government partners, creating a cycle where criminal activity funded legitimate business expansion. The breakthrough that crystallized my decision came when I discovered an encrypted email thread that Melissa had managed to recover from a backup server before her apartment was searched. The emails were between Marcus and someone identified only as Senator's office, and they detailed a coordinated strategy to use Pinnacle's rural healthcare expertise to justify their VA contract bid. In one particularly damning message, Marcus had written, "Our demonstrated success in serving underserved rural facilities gives us unique credibility with VA procurement officials. The higher margins we maintain in rural markets provide the capital flexibility we need to offer competitive government pricing while maintaining profitability targets." They were literally advertising their exploitation of rural hospitals as a business advantage that qualified them for government contracts. The systematic overcharging wasn't just criminal, it was being presented as evidence of their expertise in rural healthcare economics. That was the moment I realized that conventional whistleblower procedures wouldn't be sufficient. This wasn't just a case of corporate fraud that could be reported to regulatory agencies and resolved through normal enforcement mechanisms. This was a criminal conspiracy with political protection and government connections that would likely be warned about any traditional regulatory complaint long before investigators could secure evidence. I needed to create a situation where the evidence would be preserved and the investigation would be initiated before Pinnacle could execute the same cover-up and retaliation strategy they'd used against Melissa. That meant triggering multiple simultaneous investigations from different agencies, making it impossible for them to control the narrative or eliminate the evidence. The plan I developed was methodical and irreversible. Instead of filing a single whistleblower complaint, I would simultaneously submit documented evidence to 6 different agencies: the Department of Health and Human Services, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, the Veterans Affairs Inspector General, the State Attorney General's Office, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Government Accountability Office. But I wouldn't just send the evidence, I would structure the submissions to ensure they were immediately actionable and mutually reinforcing. Each agency would receive evidence specifically relevant to their jurisdiction, but also references to the investigations being conducted by other agencies, creating a web of coordinated scrutiny that would be impossible to suppress or redirect. The key was timing. All 6 submissions had to be delivered simultaneously, before Pinnacle could detect that their operation was being exposed and activate their countermeasures. That meant using secure communication channels that couldn't be monitored, coordinating delivery methods that wouldn't create advance warning, and ensuring that the evidence packages were complete and immediately compelling. I spent 3 days preparing the submissions, working with the kind of operational precision that had served me well in military intelligence. Each evidence package was customized for its recipient agency, highlighting the specific violations within their jurisdiction, while providing enough context to understand the broader criminal enterprise. For the FBI, I emphasized the interstate nature of the fraud and the use of wire communications to execute the scheme. For the VA Inspector General, I focused on how stolen rural hospital money had been used to fund the government contract that was now putting veteran health care at risk. For the IRS, I detailed the tax implications of the unreported income and the suspicious financial structures used to move money between entities. But the most important submission was to the State Attorney General's office, because that was where criminal charges would ultimately be filed. I provided them with a complete criminal referral package, including detailed financial analysis, documentary evidence, witness statements, and a comprehensive timeline of the conspiracy. The evidence packages were submitted using a combination of encrypted email, certified mail, and secure document upload portals. Each submission was timed to arrive during normal business hours on the same Tuesday morning, ensuring that investigators across 6 agencies would begin reviewing the evidence almost simultaneously. I didn't send anonymous tips or vague complaints. Instead, I identified myself as a former Pinnacle employee and provided detailed contact information, making it clear that I was prepared to testify and provide additional evidence as needed. The message to the agencies was unmistakable. This wasn't speculation or disgruntled employee accusations, but documented criminal activity reported by someone with direct knowledge and comprehensive evidence. After the final submission was sent, I sat back in my chair and felt something I hadn't experienced since my military service: the satisfaction of executing a complex operation with precision and completeness. There was no going back now. Within hours, federal and state investigators would be opening files on Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions, and Marcus Whitfield's carefully constructed criminal enterprise would be facing the kind of scrutiny that no amount of political connections or cultural manipulation could deflect. The war Melissa had warned me about was officially beginning, but this time, The first shots were being fired by someone who understood how to fight it. The first crack appeared exactly 72 hours after my submissions went out, manifesting as a single sentence buried on page 6 of the Charlotte Business Journal's Tuesday morning edition. Federal investigators reportedly reviewing financial practices at several regional healthcare supply companies, following anonymous complaints about billing irregularities. Anonymous complaints. I almost smiled at that. 6 different agencies had received detailed, documented evidence packages from an identified whistleblower, but the initial press coverage was already being shaped to minimize the threat. Someone at Pinnacle had connections in the media, just as they had connections in government procurement offices. But by Wednesday morning, the carefully managed narrative began to fracture. The first real indication that my strategy was working came through an unexpected source, Robert Chen, my former colleague, who had been conspicuously absent from my farewell. He reached out through LinkedIn with a message that was clearly designed to appear casual but carried undertones of urgency. Hey David, hope you're settling into whatever comes next. Crazy week here at the office. Management brought in some outside consultants to review our compliance procedures. Lots of meetings, behind closed doors. People are nervous. Anyway, hope you're doing well. The subtext was clear. Federal investigators had made contact with Pinnacle, probably requesting documents and scheduling interviews. The outside consultants were likely forensic accountants and legal advisors brought in to manage crisis response. The fact that Robert was reaching out suggested that employees were being questioned about their interactions with me, and at least some of them were beginning to understand that my termination hadn't been about cultural fit. By Thursday, the unraveling accelerated. A contact I'd cultivated at the Department of Veterans Affairs, a former military colleague who now worked in their Inspector General's office, sent me a carefully worded text message. Coffee this weekend. Have some questions about our mutual acquaintances in the medical supply business. That confirmed that the VA investigation was active and moving quickly. Given the size of Pinnacle's government contracts and the political sensitivity of veteran healthcare issues, the VA Inspector General would be under pressure to either clear Pinnacle quickly or recommend immediate contract suspension. Either outcome would create massive financial pressure on Marcus's operation. The breakthrough came Friday afternoon, when Melissa called me from a number I didn't recognize, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Turn on Channel 9 News, she said, without preamble. Right now. I switched to the local news station just as they were beginning a segment titled, Federal Investigation Targets Local Medical Supply Company. The reporter, standing in front of Pinnacle's headquarters building, was reading from what appeared to be prepared statements. Sources close to the investigation tell Channel 9 that federal agents executed search warrants this morning at the offices of Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions, seizing computers, financial records, and other documents related to an ongoing investigation into alleged billing fraud affecting rural hospitals across multiple states. The camera panned across the parking lot, showing several unmarked vehicles and agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the building. But what caught my attention was the figure visible in one of the upper floor windows, Marcus Whitfield, standing motionless behind the glass, watching his empire being systematically dismantled. The investigation reportedly began following detailed complaints filed by a former employee who documented systematic overcharging of financially struggling rural hospitals. The reporter continued. Federal prosecutors are reviewing evidence that suggests the alleged fraud may have been used to fund the company's recent expansion into lucrative government contracts, including a $47 million agreement with the Department of Veterans Affairs. There it was. The connection between the rural hospital fraud and the government contracts was now public knowledge. Marcus's carefully constructed separation between legitimate business operations and criminal activity had been exposed, making it impossible for him to claim that any irregularities were isolated incidents or rogue employee actions. But the most devastating revelation came in the final segment of the news report, when the reporter referenced additional evidence suggesting a pattern of retaliation against employees who attempted to report suspected wrongdoing, including deliberate destruction of employment records and potential witness intimidation. They had found evidence of what happened to Melissa, the break-in at her apartment, the systematic destruction of her professional reputation, the coordinated effort to silence her. All of it was now part of a federal investigation into obstruction of justice and witness tampering. Over the weekend, The story exploded across multiple media outlets. National healthcare trade publications picked up the investigation, framing it as a test case for federal enforcement of anti-fraud provisions in rural healthcare markets. Financial news services began analyzing the potential impact on government contracts and publicly traded healthcare companies with similar business models. But the most damaging coverage came from investigative reporters who had begun contacting rural hospitals that had been Pinnacle's clients. Hospital administrators who had never questioned Pinnacle's pricing started comparing notes and discovering that they had all been systematically overcharged for identical supplies and equipment. The first hospital to publicly confirm their cooperation with the federal investigation was Monroe County Regional Hospital in rural Alabama, the same facility I had identified in my original analysis as being charged $12,000 for ventilator supplies that cost Pinnacle only $3,200. When we saw the news coverage, we immediately reviewed our purchase records from Pinnacle, the hospital's chief financial officer told reporters. What we found was deeply troubling. We had trusted them to provide fair pricing for critical medical supplies, and it appears that trust was systematically violated. By Monday morning, 7 rural hospitals across 4 states had publicly announced their cooperation with the federal investigation. Each one had discovered similar patterns of overcharging, and their combined evidence created an overwhelming case for systematic fraud that spanned multiple years and affected healthcare delivery to thousands of rural patients. The psychological impact on Pinnacle's employees was swift and visible. According to Robert Chen, who had become increasingly communicative as the investigation unfolded, the office atmosphere had transformed from confident professionalism to paranoid crisis management. "Nobody's talking to each other unless they absolutely have to," he reported during a carefully arranged coffee meeting. "Everyone's wondering who else might have been documenting things, who else might be cooperating with investigators." Marcus barely leaves his office, and when he does, he looks like he hasn't slept in days. The most telling indicator of organizational collapse came when Janet Torres, my former colleague who had been with Pinnacle for 6 years, submitted her resignation. In her brief exit interview, which somehow found its way to local reporters, she stated that she could no longer work for a company whose business practices were under federal criminal investigation. "I became an accountant to help businesses operate with integrity," she said in the leaked statement. "I cannot continue to be associated with an organization that may have been systematically defrauding the very hospitals we claimed to be helping." Her resignation triggered a cascade of departures. Within a week, Pinnacle had lost nearly 30% of its staff, including most of the financial analysis team and several key regional managers. The brain drain was so severe that they were forced to suspend operations in 2 states while attempting to restructure their remaining workforce. But the final blow came when the Department of Veterans Affairs announced the immediate suspension of Pinnacle's $47 million contract, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The suspension wasn't just a financial catastrophe. It was a public statement that the federal government considered Pinnacle too compromised to handle veteran healthcare contracts. The Department of Veterans Affairs maintained zero tolerance for any suggestion of fraudulent billing practices among our contractors, the VA announcement stated. "Until these allegations are fully investigated and resolved, we cannot in good conscience continue our business relationship with Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions." The contract suspension made national news and triggered a broader review of all government healthcare contracts awarded to companies with rural hospital clients. Pinnacle wasn't just facing criminal charges, they had become the poster child for a systemic problem in healthcare procurement that regulators could no longer ignore. As I watched the coverage from my apartment, I felt the same quiet satisfaction I'd experienced after successful intelligence operations in Afghanistan. Not satisfaction from destruction, but from precision. Every element of my plan had worked exactly as intended, creating a cascade of consequences that would be impossible for Marcus to control or redirect. The man who had built his empire on the suffering of rural hospitals was now watching that empire collapse under the weight of evidence he had never known existed. And unlike Melissa's experience, this time there would be no cover-up, no witness intimidation, no carefully orchestrated narrative about cultural fit. This time, the truth was being protected by federal agents and career prosecutors who didn't care about corporate culture or political connections. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of justice. The phone call that confirmed Marcus's complete downfall came on a rainy Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the federal raids, from an unexpected source, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, who introduced herself as the lead prosecutor on what was now being called Operation Rural Shield. Mr. Mitchell, I'm calling to inform you that a federal grand jury has returned indictments against Marcus Whitfield and 4 other Pinnacle Healthcare executives, she said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent months building an airtight case. The charges include wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud healthcare programs, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Mr. Whitfield has been arrested and is currently being held pending a detention hearing. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, not from surprise, but from the weight of vindication. The man who had fired me for not fitting culture was now facing federal criminal charges that could result in decades in prison. The carefully constructed facade of serving rural healthcare had been stripped away, revealing the criminal enterprise that Melissa and I had documented with such painstaking detail. The evidence you provided was instrumental in securing these indictments. Prosecutor Chen continued. Your documentation of the systematic overcharging scheme, combined with the financial analysis you conducted, gave us the foundation we needed to build a comprehensive case. We'll need you to testify before the grand jury next week, and likely at trial if the defendants don't accept plea agreements, but the indictments were just the beginning of Marcus's reckoning. Within hours of his arrest, news outlets across the country were reporting the details of the charges, and the story they told was devastating to everything Marcus had built his reputation on. The federal complaint, which became public record upon filing, read like a catalog of systematic betrayal of rural communities. It documented how Marcus had deliberately targeted the most vulnerable hospitals in the healthcare system, exploiting their financial desperation and operational limitations to extract unconscionable profits from essential medical supplies. The numbers were staggering. According to the indictment, Pinnacle had systematically overcharged rural hospitals by more than $23 million over a 4-year period, money that came directly out of healthcare budgets that were already stretched to the breaking point. For some facilities, the excess charges represented 5 to 10% of their total annual operating budgets, enough to fund nursing positions, equipment upgrades, or community health programs that had been cut due to financial constraints. But, perhaps the most damning revelation in the federal complaint was the evidence of Marcus's personal knowledge and direction of the fraud. Prosecutors had recovered emails where Marcus explicitly instructed regional managers to maximize rural market opportunities and extract optimal value from isolated facility relationships. In one particularly incriminating message, he had written, "These hospitals have no alternatives and no leverage. Price accordingly." The psychological portrait that emerged from the federal investigation was of a man who had systematically betrayed every principle he claimed to represent. Marcus hadn't stumbled into fraud through poor judgment or gradual ethical compromise. He had deliberately constructed a criminal enterprise designed to exploit the most vulnerable participants in the healthcare system while using their stolen money to fund his expansion into prestigious government contracts. The media coverage that followed the indictments was relentless and comprehensive. Healthcare trade publications detailed the specific impact on individual rural hospitals, many of which had been forced to cut services or delay equipment purchases because of the inflated costs they'd paid to Pinnacle. Local news stations in affected communities interviewed hospital administrators who expressed both anger at the betrayal and relief that the truth had finally been exposed. "We trusted them," said Dr. Margaret Williams, Chief Medical Officer at Clearwater Regional Hospital in rural Tennessee, during a televised interview. "Marcus Whitfield came to our facility personally, talked about his commitment to rural healthcare, shook hands with our staff, all while his company was systematically stealing money that should have gone to patient care." The Veterans Affairs contract suspension became permanent within days of the indictments, with VA officials announcing a comprehensive review of all healthcare contractors to prevent similar fraud in government programs. The $47 million contract that Marcus had secured using stolen rural hospital money was terminated without compensation, leaving Pinnacle facing immediate bankruptcy. But the most personally satisfying aspect of Marcus's downfall was watching the careful narrative he'd constructed about company culture and employee loyalty completely collapse under scrutiny. The same executives who had participated in my termination for cultural fit were now facing federal investigations into their own roles in the conspiracy. Regional manager, Patricia Hayes, who had been present during several meetings where the rural pricing strategy was discussed, was indicted on conspiracy charges and immediately began cooperating with prosecutors in hopes of reducing her sentence. Her cooperation provided investigators with detailed information about how the fraud was implemented and concealed, including the systematic efforts to silence employees who might discover the scheme. Lisa Hartwell, my former supervisor who had delivered the carefully scripted concerns about my happiness and cultural alignment, was not indicted but was terminated by Pinnacle's board of directors after internal investigation revealed that she had been aware of the pricing irregularities and had actively participated in efforts to prevent employees from investigating them further. Even more satisfying was the revelation that several of my former colleagues had been documenting their own concerns about Pinnacle's practices, but had been intimidated into silence by the same cultural manipulation tactics used against me. Janet Torres, who had resigned during the federal investigation, provided prosecutors with copies of emails and meeting notes that showed how employees' legitimate questions about billing practices had been systematically deflected and discouraged. They made us feel like asking questions was disloyal, Janet told investigators. According to court documents that were later made public, David Mitchell was terminated right after he started looking closely at the Southeast accounts, and the message to the rest of us was clear: don't dig too deep. Don't ask too many questions. Don't threaten the family atmosphere. The family atmosphere that Marcus had used to justify my termination was revealed to be a sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to prevent employees from reporting criminal activity. The cultural fit narrative that had seemed so reasonable during my termination meeting was exposed as a deliberate strategy to silence whistleblowers without triggering obvious retaliation claims. Robert Chen, who had been feeding me information throughout the investigation, was eventually called to testify before the grand jury about the cultural intimidation tactics used within Pinnacle. His testimony, portions of which became public during pretrial proceedings, provided devastating insight into how the company's leadership had systematically created an environment where ethical concerns were treated as personal failures rather than legitimate business issues. Marcus would hold these company meetings where he'd talk about loyalty and trust, Robert testified, but what he really meant was don't question what you see. Don't investigate what doesn't make sense, and definitely don't talk to outsiders about company practices. When David was fired, Marcus made sure everyone understood it was because he wasn't a team player, because he was asking the wrong kinds of questions. The federal investigation also revealed the sophisticated nature of Marcus's retaliation against Melissa Rodriguez. Prosecutors had traced the break-in at her apartment to a private security company that had been hired through a series of shell corporations ultimately controlled by Pinnacle. Marcus hadn't just fired employees who threatened his operation, had been willing to commit additional felonies to silence them and destroy evidence of his crimes. The final element of Marcus's reckoning came when the state medical board began investigating whether Pinnacle's systematic overcharging had directly contributed to the closure of rural healthcare facilities or the reduction of medical services in underserved communities. The investigation found evidence that at least 3 rural hospitals had been forced to eliminate emergency services or close obstetrics units partly due to financial pressures created by Pinnacle's inflated pricing. This wasn't just financial fraud. State Medical Board Director Dr. James Patterson announced during a press conference, this was an attack on rural healthcare infrastructure that may have directly impacted patient access to life-saving medical services. The consequences of this criminal enterprise extend far beyond corporate balance sheets to real health outcomes in vulnerable communities. As I watched the coverage of these revelations, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. The man who had built his fortune by exploiting rural hospitals was now facing the consequences, not just of his crimes, but of the real-world impact those crimes had on healthcare delivery in communities that could least afford it. Marcus Whitfield, who had once sat across from me in a conference room and calmly destroyed my career for discovering his crimes, was now sitting in a federal detention facility awaiting trial on charges that could result in life imprisonment. The cultural fit narrative that had seemed so reasonable and professional was exposed as cover for systematic criminal activity. The empire built on stolen money and manipulated loyalty had collapsed completely. and this time there would be no corporate consultants, no carefully crafted separation agreements, no intimidation campaigns to protect the guilty. Federal prosecutors and career investigators had replaced the compliant corporate environment where truth could be managed and dissent could be silenced. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being delivered with the kind of systematic precision that Marcus had once used to exploit his victims. The invitation arrived on official Department of Veterans Affairs letterhead 6 weeks after Marcus's arrest. But it wasn't what I expected. Instead of a subpoena or a request for additional testimony, it was an offer that represented something far more significant than legal vindication. It was recognition of the expertise that Pinnacle had tried to erase. The Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General is establishing a new rural healthcare fraud prevention task force. The letter began, signed by Inspector General Patricia Morrison herself, given your instrumental role in exposing systematic fraud affecting rural healthcare facilities, and your demonstrated expertise in financial analysis and healthcare supply chain security. We would like to invite you to serve as Senior Consultant for Rural Healthcare Integrity. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in the same kitchen where I had organized the evidence that brought down Marcus's criminal enterprise. The position wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to build something better from the wreckage of what I had helped destroy. Instead of simply documenting fraud after it occurred, I would be designing systems to prevent it from happening in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had fired me for not fitting his corrupted culture. But the federal government was now recognizing that my unwillingness to accept that culture made me exactly the kind of person they needed to protect vulnerable healthcare facilities from future exploitation. The task force position came with significant authority and resources. I would be leading a team of investigators, forensic accountants, and healthcare policy specialists tasked with developing comprehensive fraud prevention protocols for all government healthcare contractors serving rural communities. The work would involve creating early warning systems to identify suspicious billing patterns, establishing independent audit procedures for high-risk contracts, and training healthcare facility administrators to recognize and report potential fraud. But perhaps most importantly, the position would allow me to ensure that what happened to hospitals like Monroe County Regional and Clearwater Regional would never happen again. I would be building safeguards into the system itself, making it structurally difficult for predators like Marcus to exploit rural healthcare. Vulnerabilities. The first case I worked on in my new role involved a medical supply company in Texas that was using remarkably similar tactics to those Marcus had employed at Pinnacle. The company, MedSource Southwest, had been targeting rural hospitals along the Mexican border, exploiting language barriers and limited administrative resources to systematically overcharge for basic medical supplies. Using the investigative framework I had developed during the Pinnacle case, my team was able to identify the fraud pattern within weeks rather than months. We documented systematic overcharging affecting 12 hospitals across South Texas, with excess billing totaling more than $8 million over 18 months. But more importantly, we were able to intervene before the fraud could expand or cause irreversible damage to the affected healthcare facilities. The MedSource investigation demonstrated the power of proactive fraud prevention versus reactive investigation. Instead of waiting for a whistleblower to risk their career exposing the scheme, we had systems in place that could detect suspicious patterns and trigger immediate investigation. The rural hospitals that might have suffered for years under exploitative pricing were protected within months of the scheme's implementation. During this period, I also began receiving communications from other healthcare fraud victims whose cases had been inspired by the Pinnacle investigation. A nurse in Oregon reached out about suspicious pharmaceutical pricing at her rural clinic. A hospital administrator in Montana documented concerns about equipment leasing contracts that seemed designed to trap facilities in long-term financial commitments. A procurement officer in West Virginia identified a pattern of emergency supply pricing that appeared to exploit disaster response situations. Each of these cases represented communities that had been taught by the Pinnacle investigation that they didn't have to accept exploitation as the price of accessing healthcare supplies. Rural healthcare facilities across the country were beginning to understand that they had allies in federal law enforcement and the expertise to fight back against systematic fraud. But the most personally meaningful contact came from Melissa Rodriguez, who had been following my work with the task force through professional networks. She had spent the months after Marcus's arrest rebuilding her career and her confidence, taking a position with a nonprofit organization that provided financial consulting services to rural hospitals. "I wanted you to know that what we did mattered," she said during a phone call on a quiet Sunday afternoon. "Not just because Marcus is in prison, but because hospitals are learning to protect themselves. I'm working with facilities that are asking the right questions now, demanding transparency from suppliers, creating the kind of oversight that might have prevented what happened to us." Melissa had found her own form of justice by using her experience to help other healthcare facilities avoid similar exploitation. She had become a sought-after consultant specifically because she understood both the financial vulnerabilities that made rural hospitals targets and the sophisticated techniques that predators used to exploit those vulnerabilities. The ripple effects of the Pinnacle case extended far beyond the specific fraud we had exposed. Healthcare trade organizations had begun developing new procurement guidelines based on the red flags we had identified. State medical boards were implementing enhanced oversight procedures for rural healthcare contractors. Federal agencies were coordinating more effectively to share information about suspicious billing patterns and potential fraud schemes. 6 months into my work with the task force, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Margaret Williams, the Chief Medical Officer at Clearwater Regional Hospital, who had been interviewed extensively during the media coverage of Marcus's arrest. She was calling to report something that represented the ultimate vindication of everything Melissa and I had fought for. "I wanted you to know that we just completed our first full fiscal year since the Pinnacle investigation," she said, her voice carrying genuine excitement. "With honest pricing from our new suppliers and the additional oversight procedures your task force helped us implement, we were able to restore our emergency obstetrics program and hire 2 additional nurses for our critical care unit." The money that Marcus had stolen from Clearwater Regional, money that should have gone to patient care but had instead funded his government contract expansion, was now flowing back into healthcare services for the rural community the hospital served. Real patients were receiving better care because the systematic exploitation had been stopped and prevented from spreading to other facilities. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching the broader transformation of attitudes toward healthcare fraud prevention. The Pinnacle case had demonstrated that rural healthcare fraud wasn't just a compliance issue or a financial problem. It was a direct threat to patient care and community health outcomes. That understanding had triggered a fundamental shift in how federal agencies, healthcare organizations, and rural communities approached the protection of their healthcare infrastructure. A year after Marcus's arrest, I was invited to speak at the National Rural Health Association's annual conference about fraud prevention strategies, standing before an audience of hospital administrators, healthcare policy experts, and federal officials. I realized that the cultural fit narrative Marcus had used to justify my termination had been completely inverted. "The healthcare industry needs people who don't fit corrupted cultures," I told the audience. "We need professionals who are willing to ask uncomfortable questions, who refuse to accept explanations that don't make sense, who understand that protecting healthcare resources is ultimately about protecting patients and communities." The speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it sparked conversations throughout the conference about the importance of creating organizational cultures that encouraged rather than discouraged ethical vigilance. Healthcare organizations were beginning to understand that employees like me weren't cultural problems to be managed, they were essential assets to be protected and empowered. The final element of my quiet victory came when I learned that several former Pinnacle employees had been hired by healthcare organizations specifically because of their experience with fraud detection and prevention. Janet Torres had become a compliance director at a major regional health system. Robert Chen had joined a healthcare consulting firm that specialized in rural facility procurement oversight. Even Lisa Hartwell, despite her involvement in the cultural intimidation tactics, had found work with a nonprofit organization focused on healthcare integrity training. The skills and experience that Marcus had tried to silence and suppress were now being recognized and valued throughout the healthcare industry. The cultural fit narrative that had once seemed so reasonable and professional was now understood as a warning sign of organizational corruption rather than legitimate personnel management. As I sat in my new office at the Department of Veterans Affairs, surrounded by case files and prevention protocols that would protect thousands of rural healthcare facilities from future exploitation, I reflected on the journey from that conference. room termination to this position of genuine influence and responsibility. Marcus had tried to erase me from the healthcare industry, but instead he had accidentally created someone with the motivation, expertise, and federal backing to dismantle the kind of predatory practices he had perfected. The war he had started with my termination had ended not just with his imprisonment, but with the construction of systems designed to prevent others from following in his footsteps. Hadn't just survived his attempt to destroy my career, I had transformed that attempt into the foundation for a career dedicated to protecting the vulnerable healthcare communities he had exploited. 2 years and 3 months after that 11 termination meeting, I stood in the lobby of what had once been Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions headquarters, now transformed into the Southeast Regional Office of the Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative. The irony of the location wasn't accidentally had specifically requested that our new operation be housed in the building where Marcus had once commanded his criminal empire. The space that had once buzzed with the carefully orchestrated activity of systematic fraud was now home to a team of investigators, analysts, and healthcare advocates dedicated to preventing the kind of exploitation that Marcus had perfected. The conference room where I had been fired for cultural fit had been converted into a training center where rural hospital administrators learned to identify and report suspicious billing practices. Marcus himself was serving a federal sentence in a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, his appeals exhausted and his assets forfeited to compensate the hospitals he had defrauded. His former accomplices had received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, with most of them cooperating with ongoing investigations into healthcare fraud networks across multiple states. But the real measure of victory wasn't in the prison sentences or asset forfeitures, it was in the systematic transformation of how rural healthcare procurement operated throughout the region. The Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative, which had grown from my task force position into a permanent federal program, had fundamentally altered the landscape that had made Marcus's crimes possible. We had implemented comprehensive fraud prevention systems across 7 states, creating networks of communication and oversight that made it virtually impossible for predatory suppliers to isolate and exploit vulnerable hospitals. Rural healthcare facilities that had once operated in geographic and informational isolation now participated in coordinated procurement programs that provided both better pricing and enhanced fraud protection. The impact was measurable and profound. In the 2 years since the program's implementation, we had identified and prevented 14 separate fraud schemes targeting rural hospitals, saving an estimated $47 million that would have been stolen from healthcare budgets. More importantly, we had helped restore confidence in the procurement process that allowed rural hospitals to focus on patient care rather than constantly worrying about exploitation. My team had grown to include former military personnel, healthcare professionals, and financial analysts who brought diverse expertise to the complex challenge of protecting rural healthcare infrastructure. Among them was Rebecca Martinez, a former Army medic who had transitioned into healthcare administration after serving in Afghanistan, and who understood both the operational realities of medical care under resource constraints and the systematic thinking required to build effective protection systems. What makes this work, Rebecca had told me during a recent strategy meeting, is that we're not just catching bad actors after they've done damage, we're changing the fundamental dynamics that make these crimes possible in the first place. She was right. The Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative wasn't just a law enforcement program, it was a comprehensive restructuring of how rural healthcare facilities accessed medical supplies and equipment. We had created cooperative purchasing agreements that gave individual hospitals the collective bargaining power they lacked when dealing with suppliers independently. We had established standardized pricing databases that made it easy for administrators to identify when they were being overcharged. We had built communication networks that allowed hospitals to share information about suppliers and alert each other to potential problems. But perhaps most importantly, we had fundamentally changed the culture around healthcare procurement in rural communities. Hospital administrators who had once felt isolated and vulnerable now understood that they were part of a larger network of professionals committed to protecting healthcare resources and ensuring that every dollar spent on medical supplies actually contributed to patient care. The transformation was visible during the quarterly Rural Healthcare Security Conference that we hosted in the same building where Marcus had once planned his criminal activities. Hospital administrators, procurement officers, and healthcare advocates from across the Southeast gathered to share information, discuss best practices, and coordinate responses to emerging threats. During the most recent conference, I had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Margaret Williams from Clearwater Regional Hospital, whose facility had been one of Marcus's primary victims. She had become a passionate advocate for fraud prevention and had helped train administrators at dozens of other rural hospitals. "The difference isn't just in the money we're saving," she explained during a panel discussion about fraud prevention success stories. "It's in the confidence we have now that we're not being taken advantage of. Our board can approve equipment, purchases, and supply contracts, knowing that we have the expertise and support to ensure we're getting fair value for our healthcare dollars." That confidence had translated into tangible improvements in healthcare delivery throughout the region. Hospitals that had been forced to cut services due to inflated supply costs were able to restore programs and expand patient care options. Emergency departments that had been operating with minimal equipment were able to upgrade their capabilities. Rural communities that had been losing healthcare services were seeing those services stabilized and improved. The success of the Southeast program had attracted attention from federal policymakers and healthcare organizations nationwide. I had been invited to testify before congressional committees about rural healthcare fraud prevention, consulted with state governments implementing similar programs, and worked with international healthcare organizations interested in adapting our model to protect vulnerable healthcare facilities in other countries. But the most personally meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: the American Organization for Nursing Leadership, which presented me with their annual Healthcare Integrity Award for transforming a personal experience of retaliation into a systematic solution that protects healthcare resources and improves patient outcomes throughout rural America. Standing at the podium to accept the award, I looked out at an audience filled with healthcare professionals who understood the daily challenges of protecting patient care resources from exploitation and abuse. Many of them had their own stories of discovering fraud, reporting concerns, and facing retaliation from organizations more interested in protecting profits than patients. "The healthcare industry has taught us that questioning suspicious practices makes you a poor cultural fit," I said during my acceptance speech. "But patients and communities deserve healthcare professionals who are willing to be poor cultural fits in corrupt organizations. They deserve advocates who will risk their careers to protect healthcare resources and ensure that every dollar spent on medical care actually reaches the patients who need it." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of the Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative's success. It was acknowledgement from healthcare professionals across the country that the fight against systematic exploitation was a fundamental part of their professional responsibility. In the months that followed the award ceremony, I began receiving contacts from healthcare professionals in other regions who had identified suspicious patterns in their own facilities and were seeking guidance on how to investigate and report potential fraud. The network of healthcare integrity advocates that had grown from the Pinnacle case was expanding nationally, creating an informal but effective system for identifying and preventing healthcare fraud before it could cause widespread damage. One of the most satisfying developments was learning that several medical schools and healthcare administration programs had begun incorporating fraud prevention training into their curricula, using the Pinnacle case as a teaching example of how seemingly legitimate business practices could mask systematic criminal activity. Future healthcare professionals were being trained to recognize red flags and understand their ethical obligations to protect healthcare resources from exploitation. The final element of my rebuilt foundation came when Melissa Rodriguez joined the Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative as Deputy Director for Fraud Prevention Training. Her experience as both a victim of healthcare fraud and a survivor of retaliation made her uniquely qualified to help other healthcare professionals navigate the complex challenges of reporting suspected wrongdoing while protecting their careers and personal safety. "What we've built here," Melissa said during her first staff meeting, "is proof that healthcare fraud doesn't have to be accepted as the cost of doing business in rural communities. We've shown that systematic exploitation can be prevented, that vulnerable hospitals can be protected, and that healthcare professionals who stand up to corruption can ultimately prevail." Working alongside Melissa, in the same building where we had both been targeted for elimination, felt like the completion of a circle that had begun in that coffee shop in Asheville, where she had first warned me about the scope of what I was fighting. We had survived Marcus's attempt to destroy us, helped send him to federal prison, and built something from that experience that would protect thousands of healthcare professionals and millions of patients from similar exploitation. that as I settled into my office each morning, surrounded by case files documenting prevented frauds and success stories from protected hospitals, I reflected on the journey from that conference room termination to this position of genuine authority and impact. Marcus had fired me for not fitting his corrupt culture, but that refusal to fit had ultimately enabled me to build a better culture, one where healthcare integrity was valued over corporate profits, and where protecting patients took precedence over protecting predators. The war that had begun with my termination had ended not just with victory, but with transformation. I hadn't simply recovered from Marcus's attempt to destroy my career. I had used that experience to create something far more significant than anything I could have achieved within his corrupted organization. Every rural hospital that operated with confidence in their supply chain, every healthcare professional who felt empowered to report suspicious practices, every patient who received better care because resources weren't being stolen by predatory suppliers, they were all part of the legacy that had grown from those 11 minutes in conference room C, where Marcus had thought he was ending my story. Instead, he had given me the foundation to write a much better one. The call came on a cold Thursday morning in December, almost exactly 3 years after my termination. I was reviewing fraud prevention protocols for a new multi-state initiative when my assistant informed me that Marcus Whitfield was requesting a meeting. He had been released early from federal prison after serving 18 months of his 22-year sentence, his time reduced due to cooperation with ongoing investigations into healthcare fraud networks. He specifically asked to meet with you, she said, her voice carrying the incredulity we all felt. Says he has something important to discuss about rural healthcare reform. My first instinct was to refuse. I had built a new life and a meaningful career from the wreckage of his criminal enterprise. The last thing I needed was a confrontation with the man who had tried to destroy me for discovering his crimes. But curiosity won out over caution. After 3 years of success, I was confident enough in my position to face the person who had once held absolute power over my professional future. We met at a small restaurant in downtown Charlotte, neutral territory where neither of us would have an advantage. Marcus arrived first, and I almost didn't recognize him. The confident executive who had once commanded boardrooms and intimidated employees had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely broken. His expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing. His commanding presence had diminished to nervous energy. Most tellingly, his eyes had lost the calculating coldness that had once made him so effective at manipulating people and situations. "David," he said as I approached the table, his voice carrying none of the authority I remembered, "thank you for agreeing to see me." I sat down across from him, maintaining the neutral expression that had served me well during my military service and throughout the investigation that had brought him down. "You said you had something important to discuss." Marcus nodded, fidgeting with his coffee cup in a way that suggested this conversation had been rehearsed but was still difficult for him to navigate. "I've spent the last year and a half thinking about what I did, what I became. Prison gives you a lot of time to reflect on the choices that led you there." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "I destroyed people, good people, people who were trying to do the right thing. Melissa Rodriguez, you, probably others I don't even know about. I convinced myself I was building something important, serving rural healthcare, but really I was just stealing from the most vulnerable people in the system." I listened without responding, curious about where this was leading but unwilling to make it easier for him by offering forgiveness or understanding he hadn't earned. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "I actually understood rural healthcare challenges better than most people in the industry. Before I started stealing from hospitals, I genuinely cared about the problems they faced. I knew how to identify their needs, how to build relationships with administrators, how to navigate the complex regulatory environment they operated in." He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since I'd sat down, his voice carried a hint of the passion that had once made him so convincing. "I want to use that knowledge differently now. I want to help build something legitimate, something that actually serves the communities I spent years exploiting." I raised an eyebrow, finally speaking. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I want to work for the Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative," he said, the words coming out in a rush as if he'd been afraid he wouldn't have the courage to say them. Not in any leadership role, obviously, but as someone who understands how healthcare fraud operates from the inside, someone who can help identify schemes before they cause damage. The audacity of the request was breathtaking. The man who had built a criminal empire by exploiting rural hospitals wanted to join the organization, dedicated to preventing exactly that kind of exploitation. It was either the ultimate act of redemption or the most sophisticated manipulation attempt I'd ever encountered. "You want me to recommend that we hire the person whose fraud schemes we spent years dismantling?" I asked, my voice calm but carrying an edge of disbelief. Marcus shook his head quickly. "I'm not asking for a recommendation. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I understand what I did wrong, and that I can use that understanding to prevent others from making the same choices. Give me the most entry-level position you have. Let me earn back even a fraction of the trust I destroyed." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize during our time working together, but what I saw was something I'd never seen from Marcus before. Genuine humility mixed with what appeared to be authentic remorse. "The hospitals I defrauded," he continued, "they're still struggling with the financial damage I caused. Clearwater Regional had to delay equipment upgrades for 2 years because of money I stole from them. Monroe County Regional almost lost their accreditation because they couldn't afford the compliance improvements they needed. I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to undo some of that damage." I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications of what he was proposing. From a practical standpoint, his insider knowledge of healthcare fraud techniques could be valuable for prevention efforts. From a symbolic standpoint, having the architect of one of the region's most devastating healthcare fraud schemes working to prevent similar crimes would send a powerful message about redemption and accountability. But I also knew that the decision wasn't mine alone to make. Any consideration of Marcus's request would need to involve the hospitals he had victimized, the colleagues whose careers he had threatened, and the broader healthcare community that had been damaged by his crimes. "I'll tell you what," I said finally. "Dr. Margaret Williams is chairing our next quarterly advisory board meeting. If you're serious about this, you can present your proposal to her and the other hospital administrators you defrauded. If they're willing to consider giving you a chance to make amends, then we can discuss what role, if any, you might play in prevention efforts." Marcus nodded eagerly, apparently understanding that this was more opportunity than he had any right to expect. "I'll do whatever they ask. Community service, restitution payments, public speaking about the real cost of healthcare fraud, whatever it takes to begin making up for what I did." As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "I brought something that might be useful, regardless of whether you decide to work with me," he said, sliding the folder across the table. "It's a list of other healthcare executives I knew who were using similar fraud schemes. Some of them are probably still active." I opened the folder to find detailed notes about healthcare supply companies, pharmaceutical distributors, and medical equipment leasing firms that Marcus suspected of engaging in systematic fraud targeting rural hospitals. The information was thorough and specific, the kind of intelligence that could prevent millions of dollars in future theft and protect dozens of vulnerable healthcare facilities. "This is just from my own knowledge and observations," Marcus explained. "If your team investigated even half of these companies, you'd probably find evidence of widespread fraud that's happening right now." Walking back to my car after the meeting, I reflected on the strange turn my career had taken. 3 years ago, Marcus Whitfield had fired me for not fitting his corrupt culture. Now he was asking to join the organization I had built to prevent the kind of crimes he had committed. The man who had once threatened my professional survival was now seeking my help to rebuild his own destroyed reputation. But perhaps more importantly, his request represented something larger than personal redemption. It demonstrated that the work we had done through the Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative had fundamentally changed the conversation around healthcare fraud. Instead of being seen as an inevitable cost of doing business in rural markets, systematic exploitation was now understood as a preventable crime that damaged real communities and hurt real patients. The folder Marcus had given me contained enough information to launch investigations that could protect hundreds of healthcare facilities and save millions of dollars that would otherwise be stolen from patient care budgets. Whether or not we ever worked with Marcus directly, his inside knowledge of healthcare fraud networks would help us build more effective prevention systems and identify threats before they could cause widespread damage. 3 weeks later, Dr. Margaret Williams called to inform me that the advisory board had voted unanimously to accept Marcus's proposal for supervised community service focused on fraud prevention education. He would work under strict oversight, with all of his activities monitored and his communications recorded. His role would be limited to sharing information about fraud techniques and helping train hospital administrators to recognize red flags. "We're not doing this because we've forgiven him," Dr. Williams explained. "We're doing it because rural hospitals can't afford to let pride prevent us from using every available tool to protect our communities from future exploitation." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the story that had begun with my termination in Conference Room C had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful than simple justice or revenge. We had built something that was bigger than any individual's crimes or redemption, comprehensive system for protecting vulnerable healthcare communities that could adapt and grow regardless of who participated in it. The Rural Healthcare Integrity Initiative continued to expand, now operating in 12 states and preventing an estimated $200 million in annual fraud targeting rural hospitals. The team I led had grown to include former victims of healthcare fraud, career investigators, healthcare professionals, and now even a reformed perpetrator whose insider knowledge helped us stay ahead of evolving criminal schemes. Every success story, every hospital that avoided exploitation, every community that maintained healthcare services, every patient who received better care because resources weren't stolen by predators represented a victory not just over Marcus's specific crimes, but over the broader culture of exploitation that had made those crimes possible. But the most meaningful measure of our success was simpler and more personal. In 3 years, we hadn't received a single report of a healthcare professional being fired for cultural fit after reporting suspected fraud to their supervisors. The climate of fear and intimidation that had once silenced potential whistleblowers had been replaced by a culture that valued and protected employees who questioned suspicious practices. Young healthcare professionals entering the field now understood that integrity and analytical thinking were professional assets, not cultural liabilities. They learned during their training that protecting healthcare resources was a fundamental part of their responsibility to patients and communities. As I prepared for another day of fraud prevention work in the building where Marcus had once commanded his criminal empire, I reflected on how completely the narrative had been transformed. The conference room where I was once told I didn't fit the culture had become a training center where we taught healthcare professionals that refusing to fit corrupt cultures was exactly the kind of professional courage their communities needed. Man who had tried to erase me from the healthcare industry had inadvertently helped me build something far more significant than anything I could have achieved within his corrupted organization. Every rural hospital operating with confidence in their supply chain, every healthcare professional empowered to report suspicious practices, every patient receiving better care because resources weren't being stolen. They were all part of a legacy that had grown from those 11 minutes where Marcus thought he was ending my story. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that integrity and courage can ultimately triumph over corruption and intimidation, then I invite you to be part of this community. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about people who refuse to accept that wrongdoing was just the way business is done. Hit that notification bell to join thousands of others who believe that one person with evidence and determination can change entire systems. Share this story with anyone who's ever been told they don't fit the culture when they were really just refusing to fit the corruption, because sometimes the best thing you can be in a broken system is exactly the wrong fit. The war against exploitation isn't won by individuals, it's won by communities of people who refuse to stay silent when they witness wrongdoing. Subscribe now, and let's build that community together. Your voice, your integrity, your willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, they matter more than you know. And if you ever find yourself in a conference room being told you don't fit the culture, remember, maybe the problem isn't with you. Maybe the problem is with the culture itself. Subscribe now, because the next story of courage and justice might be your own.